Good morning. Hopefully everyone can see the presentation and, unfortunately for you, me, and hear me. Welcome to the Go-create grant application overview webinar on 1st of April 2021. I'm James Rule. I'm a consultant who provides compliance support services to OxLEP, and I'm going to be presenting the webinar today. As you've heard from the introductory voice that we always get, the webinar is being recorded, and the recording of the webinar will be made live on the website after the session, hopefully today, but at latest tomorrow. We will be joined in the second half of the webinar by business advisor Peter Russell and Catherine Shepherd from the ISfB team, who are going to be taking questions with me. And if we can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. The agenda for the day is that for the first hour, I'm going to present an overview of the grants process. So this will cover things like eligibility, how you apply, the rules that we have to follow, the key dates, and then a session on why applications are unsuccessful. So things that can go wrong, things that you should avoid doing. We'll then have a brief comfort break, or in my case, a brief refill the coffee mug break. And then we'll go into the ISfB Go-create grant focused part of the webinar. I've got a brief couple of slides on that, and then we'll take questions from the floor, and then we'll take any final questions, if there are any, and close down. Having run these in the past, where we've covered both ISfB and the Escalate program, and given that this time the webinar is only focusing on ISfB Go-create grants, I'm expecting that we'll finish a bit ahead of midday. Please type any questions into the chat. If the team can answer them as we go through, they will post a comment back to you. Please try and make sure that questions are generic, so please don't put anything commercially confidential in the questions to us, at least partly because the rest of the webinar attendees may be able to see the answers and the questions. If there's any questions you don't have time to ask or you think of as soon as we finish the webinar, please email them to the business@oxfordshirelep.com email address and we'll pick those up. Okay, on to the next slide. So a bit of background, who we are, who is OxLEP. OxLEP is the Oxfordshire Local Enterprise Partnership. We're one of an England-wide network of, I think, about 29 local enterprise partnerships who are responsible for supporting local businesses. So we run a growth hub in each of the different LEP areas, as well as skills and economic development work. Within OxLEP Business, which is where the Innovation Support for Business, the ISfB project sits, we operate the growth hub and various other government-funded activities, such as the recently launched Business Investment Fund and things like our peer networking programs. So ISfB is part of OxLEP's Growth Hub offer to support businesses, and we focus on the supporting innovative businesses. So next slide. Thank you. So in terms of the overview of the program and the details and the eligibility requirements, the elephant in the room, if you like, is the UK's departure from the European Union. Apologies if everyone can hear a howling toddler. That's off screen and the door is locked. Effectively, there have been no changes to the program as a result of the UK's departure from the European Union. The program's ERDF, European Regional Development Fund, and the other structural investment funds remain part of the European Structural and Investment Funds system until they close down in a couple of years' time. Therefore, they continue to be governed by the same EU regulations as they were before we left the European Union, and the UK Managing Authority's guidance is based on those. So effectively nothing changes from the point of view of delivery and management of these programs. Next slide. So what that means in terms of eligibility is that we still operate to the EU definition of an SME. So to apply for a Go-create grant, you must be an SME. So that means that you must have less than 250 employees. You cannot be more than 25% owned by a non-SME. So if you're part of a group of companies, you have to look at the whole group of companies together to establish whether or not that group is an SME. It can get a little complicated there because there are certain owners that don't count towards the 25% threshold. Things like venture capitalists and universities do not count towards that 25% threshold. You also need to have a turnover of less than 50 million euros in your last published accounts, and or a balance sheet of less than 43 million euros. So those are the eligibility criteria. You will, before you apply for a Go-create grant, already have signed up to the ISfB program, and within the sign-up form that you will have completed, we will have run through these eligibility issues. Within your application itself, you'll just need to confirm that nothing has changed from your sign-up form. So on to the next slide, please. The other thing that we do need to take into account is what they call undertakings in difficulty. Now, this is to ensure that public funding, European funding in this case, is not given to support businesses that are effectively going out of business or that are deemed to be in difficulty. There's separate types of support for that, things like restructuring or rescue aid. And frankly, if you're receiving that, you will know that you've had it. Undertakings in difficulty, the test does not apply to any SME that is less than 3 years old. But if you are more than 3 years old, then essentially the test says if you have lost more than half of your subscribed share capital as a result of accumulated losses, then you're deemed to be in difficulty. So the table at the bottom of the slide sets out a couple of different scenarios and whether or not they pass or fail the undertaking in difficulty test. So if your capital is 10,000 and you've lost nothing, so you've got no accumulated losses, clearly you're not in difficulty, you pass the test. Same capital base, if you've lost £4,999 cumulatively, you'll still pass the test. Whereas if you've lost £5,001 or more against your capital of 10,000, then you will fail the test. For anyone who effectively has zero share capital, and we do get some businesses set up like that, the result of this rather blunt test is that you cannot have any accumulated losses, because if you have no share capital, there is nothing to set the loss against. This can be quite complicated, so please contact the team for clarification. The other thing to note is that it is both the age and financial position of the business as at December 2019 that counts. Now, that was a flexibility that was introduced in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, where it became very clear that a significant number of businesses would be deemed undertakings in difficulty as a result of the impact of COVID. So what the European Commission said was that they would suspend that test and look at the position of the business in 31st of December 2019, so before any impacts of COVID-19 could be felt. They've recently extended this flexibility through to June 2021, and it would not be a huge surprise if it's extended further beyond that. But for applicants who are going to receive grants in this round and the next round, you don't need to worry about that if you pass the test or were less than 3 years old at December 2019. So the next slide then is a slightly more technical version, an explanation. I said it was a blunt test. It is a very simple calculation based on the last full year of accounts or your position at December 2019, looking at the balance sheet. You will already have completed a self-declaration in your sign-up form saying that you're not an undertaking in difficulty. It's worth noting that we have to carry out a formal check if we're giving a grant or aid of more than £50,000, although that's extremely unlikely, even for Go-create grants. Otherwise, we do have to do random spot checks of the undertakings in difficulty test. Critical thing to say is that if you're in doubt, speak to your accountant. And I've written a fairly simple formula there to share with them, which should advise whether you pass or fail. This is not a particularly easy area when people have queries on it, but as I say, we will do our best to help you through it. So on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So what are the key eligibility issues for a Go-create grant? The first one is that staff costs are not an eligible cost. So you cannot include salaried staff costs as part of your grant project. Consultancy costs is fine. So if you bring in a consultant on a non-staff contract, then that is a perfectly eligible cost. They can charge for their time, you pay their invoice, and then that can be included in your project costs. But anything that goes through the salary line, so any NI and pension attracting costs, anything that is salary, is not eligible under the Go-create ISfB scheme. VAT costs you can include, but only if either you are not registered for VAT, so therefore there's no way for you to recover that VAT from anyone, or your VAT position means that for whatever reason you can't recover that VAT from HMRC. VAT is an even more complicated area than the undertakings in difficulty tests, and OxLEP is not in a position to give VAT advice to applicants. We can explain it, but we strongly recommend that you seek advice from your accountants or financial advisors about whether or not the VAT is recoverable. So whether you can get it back from HMRC as part of your VAT returns, or whether, if not, it is part of the eligible costs for the project. There's no right or wrong answer to this. You don't gain points or lose points in the assessment for including or excluding VAT. But it's important to note that it is very difficult for us, once we've issued a grant, to then suddenly increase that grant for 20% because the applicant forgot to include VAT that they needed to include. The next critical eligibility issue is around procurement. We do require you to follow an abridged version of public procurement requirements, because that is what our auditors require of us and require for the approval of ERDF expenditure. So we will need to see an audit trail for procurements and selection of suppliers. And at its simplest, so for anything below 25,000, excluding VAT, that means copies of the 3 quotes that you've got to compare the prices. For anything that costs more than £25,000, so 25,000 and above, there's a requirement to run an open procurement. So in ERDF terms, that means that there must be a copy of a Contracts Finder advert, Contracts Finder being the government website that lists all public procurement opportunities. And there should also therefore be a formal specification which should include details of how you will score the response, as well as setting out the requirements, copies of that scoring that you've carried out, evidence that responses were received before the formal deadline, sort of standard evidence that demonstrates you followed an open and competitive process. One eligibility issue that we often come across is where suppliers that applicants have selected are those who are already involved in some way, shape or form within the applicant business. This is not necessarily a problem, and you can certainly select a supplier that you already know and that you already work with, but it becomes absolutely critical, even more critical, to be able to provide evidence of the selection process. So evidence of the 3 quotes that you sought, evidence of the open procurement, and where the supplier is involved in the business, making absolutely certain that that supplier had no unfair advantage in the procurement process. So, for example, if your supplier were to be providing project management support to your business on a different element of activity, and you then used some of that time to have them draft a specification for project management support for your Go-create project, that supplier cannot then apply for and be awarded the Go-create project management role. They have had an unfair advantage over other suppliers in the process. There's also eligibility issues around defrayal. ERDF money and our grants need to be paid on the basis of defrayed expenditure. So that means that money has to have left your business bank account. Now that sounds fairly straightforward, but of course, when you think about it, there'll be things that you would want to buy on credit cards, for example. This is perfectly acceptable, but it introduces an additional step into the audit trail process. So not only do we need to see the invoice for the item, for whatever it is, and a copy of the credit card bill redacted, because we don't need to see the rest of it, demonstrating that that has been paid. We will also need to see evidence of defrayal from your bank account that pays off the credit card to at least the same value as the amount that you're claiming. So if you spend £4,000 on something on a credit card, we need to see the invoice for £4,000, the credit card receipt that shows the credit card was used to pay the £4,000 to that supplier, and then a bank statement that shows at least £4,000 going from the bank account to pay off the credit card, because it's based on defrayed expenditure, and defrayal is your defrayal as a business, so from your bank account. It's possible to pay for things rather using overseas bank accounts. I know that various businesses will have overseas bank accounts, and we do accept that it is more cost effective sometimes to pay a euro invoice in euros if you have them, rather than incur transaction and exchange rate fees. This is fine, but it becomes a little bit more complicated in terms of the audit trail. The reason for that is that if you pay a euro invoice out of your UK sterling bank account, the bank account will very helpfully have a line that sets out the euro value, the exchange rate, any fees, and then the sterling value, and it's that sterling value that you're claiming from us. So there is a very easy way to follow the euro value all the way through the process to the sterling value that actually appears in your claim. If you're using an overseas bank account that already had some foreign currency in, there is no piece of paper, effectively, that demonstrates the exchange rate that translated your sterling into that foreign currency. So what you need to do, please tell us first of all if you're planning to do this, but then you need to identify and justify an exchange rate that you plan to use in your claim. Usually that will be the European Central Bank rate in force on the day or month that you make the transaction. But please clarify it and explain which rate you have used. What we should be able to do is take the euro number, apply the exchange rate to it, and come up with the sterling figure that you're using. We have had significant problems squaring away overseas bank account transactions with claimed sterling figures. It sounds simple in theory, but in practice it can be complicated. And that's why we would prefer to know that it's going to happen in advance, so that we can advise you, so that you don't get a series of questions from us when the claim is submitted even, and we can work with you in advance so that we can then process and approve the claim more quickly. Next slide. Thank you. There is a difference between revenue and capital costs. The Go-create grants for ISfB allow both revenue and capital costs to be included. So under ERDF rules, a capital item is any individual item that costs more than 4,999. So anything less than 5,000 is revenue, anything more than 5,000, and it's always excluding VAT, is deemed to be a fixed asset, is the technical term for the guidance. So it's a capital asset. As ever, it's not quite as simple as that, because any item, even if it's revenue, that costs you more than £1,000 but less than 4,999 is classed as a mobile asset. So you might buy a particularly expensive laptop, never a particularly good example, but a reasonable example of a mobile asset that could easily cost somewhere between £1,000 and 4,999. It will be an item of revenue expenditure, but as a mobile asset, the same as a fixed asset, they will need to be reported to us and recorded in the project's asset register. So that's our register of all of the assets that the ISfB program has funded. And it includes details like the cost, description of the asset, where it's stored, what it's used for, serial numbers, photographs. The auditors do require photographs of the asset, and I hasten to say photographs of the asset in situ, in place. So if you have bought a laptop, please don't send us a close-up photograph of the laptop, which could have been taken on a beach, in the shop, on your desk, could have been taken anywhere because we can't see the context. We do need a photograph of the laptop, the 3D printer, whatever it may be, showing where it's based. We'll also need a photograph of the asset number that's on it, so serial number, which will match the number in the asset register. You should also tell us how that asset will be depreciated and over what period. We're not going to query the depreciation method that you use, but we ask you to please use your standard method. If you're going to use something different, please explain it to us and justify it. But the reason for that is that since assets have a fixed life and the asset has been funded by the ISfB Go-create program, there is an obligation on you to use that asset for the purposes for which it was funded throughout its useful life. So if your laptop is going to be used for, I don't know, software development, say, and you depreciate it over 3 years, even once your project is finished, you need to continue using that laptop for software development until it's depreciated. So at the end of 3 years, you can sell it, throw it away, recycle it, whatever it is you would do with it. If you dispose of that asset after 1.5 years, so when it has only depreciated by about 50%, you would need to tell us, and we may be required to recover the undepreciated element of that asset, the undepreciated value of that asset. As I said, any item over 5,000 is a capital item, and if you want to include capital items over 5,000, you must make sure that you're applying and have selected that you wish to include capital spend in your project. Next slide. Thank you. So there are some things we can't fund. I've already talked about salary costs, absolutely ineligible in any way, shape or form. We can't fund travel and expenses costs, unfortunately. We can't fund VAT payments you can recover from HMRC. I've talked about them earlier as well. We cannot fund debt or refinancing costs, so nothing that has an interest related element. So we can't cover loan payments, nor can we cover anything that is a statutory or legislative requirement. So if there is a piece of kit or an accreditation or something that you are legally required to have in order to develop your innovation, to market your innovation, we can't fund you to get that. If, however, there's an accreditation that's a nice to have, our customers, our product is accredited to the legal requirements, but we know from our market research that customers are more enthusiastic about products that have a higher level of accreditation beyond the legal requirements. That is something that we can fund and that we can help with. We can't fund training. Now, that doesn't include leadership and management development, so things like paying for mentors to help develop innovations and lead and develop the innovation team, that's eligible. But we can't fund training courses. The reason for that is that it's the European Social Fund that is the instrument for funding training qualifications, not the European Regional Development Fund. We certainly can't fund vehicle purchases, and as I mentioned, hire purchase arrangements are not eligible because they include an interest element, so it's a debt financing type element. Next slide. One day when I do these, I'm going to get a sign made I can hold up that says next slide. I keep meaning to. As I've said before, no vehicles. Please don't buy any vehicles. This is deliberately in the slide presentation twice, simply because it is something that auditors look for when they come to Oxfordshire. There was a historic ERDF programme in the previous programme period who had an underspend, and they decided that a good way to use up that underspend would be to nip out and buy a car. I'm not entirely sure what the auditor said when they came and discovered it, but they certainly had to repay the value of the car. We can't fund a like-for-like or routine replacement of anything, or preventative or remedial maintenance. So if you have a machine that needs refurbishing because it's wearing out, and after refurbishment is going to be as good as new and no better, that's not something that we can fund. That's remedial maintenance, that's refurbishment. If that machine is wearing out and you want to replace it with exactly the same machine that allows you to do exactly the same as you could do before, that's a like-for-like replacement. We cannot fund that. However, if your machine is wearing out and you want to buy a new machine that is different, that allows you to make a different type of new innovative widget or make them twice as fast, whatever it may be, that is something that we can support through the scheme because it's not a routine replacement. It's not a like-for-like replacement. We're not allowed to support the building or refurbishment of retail facilities, just because that's how the scheme is set up. Because we operate under the de minimis EU state aid rules, we cannot support certain sectors. So primary production of agricultural goods and fisheries or aquaculture. So we can't support farmers, we can't support market gardeners, we can't support fish farms. We're not allowed to support road freight businesses, nor are we allowed to support services of general economic interest. When I deliver this in person, I like to look around the room and see how many people look completely confused at that phrase. Services of general economic interest are things like schools, universities, the NHS, organisations like OxLEP. We can't fund exported related activities, so that does not mean that we're unable to support you if you want to export your innovation. We certainly can. What it means is that we're not allowed to help you set up the infrastructure in order to export. Okay, so it's very focused about setting up your export infrastructure and chains. Nor, unsurprisingly, can we support activities that favour domestic over imported goods. So what I mean by that is that if your application says, and you should support us because we're not willing to use any overseas suppliers, we're only willing to use UK suppliers, we will not be able to support that application because you're favouring domestic over imported goods. Next slide. Thank you. As you can imagine, there are some deliverables that we have to report. There are some fairly straightforward ones. There's the grant. Well, we know how much that is because we awarded it to you and because we paid it to you. There's the match funding that you have put into the project. Again, we know how much that is because we've seen the claim and we know the difference between the grant and your total expenditure. We also need to report the employment increase. So this is new jobs, not jobs safeguarded, newly created jobs. And there is a self-declaration for this on an impacts form in which you will certify that you had X jobs before the project, and as a result of the project and the support you've had from ISfB, you've now got Y jobs. Therefore, we've created 1, 2, whatever it may be, new jobs as a result of the project. You then need to provide some basic information about the projects, number of hours a week, salary level, and some ethnicity equalities data, on those filling the job. So that's ethnicity, gender, disability. No identifying details. They do not require that, but copies of job descriptions may well be required by an auditor. We also report new products to the firm and market. Again, you can declare that on the impacts form, and supporting evidence for that sort of thing will be marketing collateral. So this shouldn't be anything that you don't have as a result of bringing a new product to the firm or to the market. If you bring a new product to the market, you will have some way, be it a new page on your website, a new flyer, news coverage that says, we have this new product, please come and buy it. That's what an auditor will look at to confirm that it really exists. We also report new businesses that we've supported. You don't need to worry about that, really, because it's a catch-all that covers any business we support that's less than 12 months old. We know that from your application form for the programme, because you tell us when the business was formed, so we already have that information. With all of these things, as I've said, evidence is needed, there's a form. It's a structured process and we'll walk you through it. Next slide. So how do you apply? Read the guidance on the website, speak to the team, watch this webinar as many times as you wish, complete the application form. Please use the application form checklist. It's extremely helpful, I know it is, I wrote it, to make sure that you complete all of the elements of the application form and attachments that we require. And then please wait and see. We do publish a time scale or timetable, which is in a later slide, which will set out when rounds close and the date on which, by which I should say, we expect to let you know. If the round is likely to take longer to assess because we've been inundated with applications, we will inform all applicants and give them an updated timeline, but please don't chase the team until after the date at which we've said we will let you know, because we have a process and we run the applications through them. Next slide. So I promised you a timeline slide, and there it is. The next cutoff date for ISfB Go-create applications is the 16th of April 2021 at midday, and we will expect to have notified applicants of the outcome of their application on or by the 7th of May. So it takes us just under a month to do this, and you'll see that the next application deadline a month later, always the third Friday of the month, is the 21st of May, again midday, it is a perfectly reasonable expectation that the next cut-off date to that will be the third Friday in June. For the May applications, we'll notify by the 11th of June. It's worth noting that in earlier rounds of ISfB, we were able to offer a soft check proofreading service for applicants. Given the volume of applications that we're getting through the door for our current projects, this is not something that we're currently able to do. If that changes, if we suddenly can offer the soft check proofreading service, we will publicize that widely. It will go onto our website. But it's not something that I'm expecting we'll be able to offer for either the April or May closing dates. So the next slide then talks about the specific rules of the fund. I've talked about defrayed expenditure, so you have to have spent the money before you can claim it from us, and you have to have spent the whole of the money, so the match and the ERDF. You put a claim in to us for the total cost that you've spent, and we will reimburse you the grant rate. So if we've given you a grant rate of 25% for a Go-create grant, we will reimburse you 25% of the total costs. Or if you're making a single claim and you've overspent, we will reimburse you the grant that we've offered. There's a slide that explains how that works later on. The procurement rules, 3 quotes are a requirement. Evidence is critical. At all stages of the process, we are subject to audit, and the auditors require an audit trail. They need to see the evidence that allows them to take a step-by-step approach to reviewing the process and to understanding how the RDF money has been spent. So I think we operate as flexible a system as we can within a fairly rigid set of rules. There are some things that we cannot flex, that we cannot change, but where we can, we're as accommodating as possible to try and make this as painless a process as possible for the applicants and the grant recipients. Next slide. So I'm now moving on to the last part of the first hour of the webinar, which covers why applications are unsuccessful. There's a reason that I don't do a session called How to Write a Successful Application, and that's because this is a competitive process. It is entirely possible that you would follow all of my hints and tips for writing a successful application, and you would still be unsuccessful. It is a competitive process, and therefore, if you do everything I tell you and you are not successful, theoretically you could sue. And that's not really a position any of us want to be in. So I run a session called Why Applications Are Unsuccessful, effectively learning from things that have gone wrong in my almost 20 years of running grant programs. So first of all, there's length. Think Goldilocks. I either get confused expressions or a laugh when I say that, but what I mean by that is that your application should be neither too short nor too long. It should be just right. We do set length limits within the application form. These are maximum lengths. They are not targets. You do not necessarily gain bonus points by filling as many words as we allow into the response. You need to write whatever needs to be written, he says very unhelpfully, to explain your business and your project. So the rule of thumb with that is that if you've written 1 paragraph and you think, well, that's enough, that's clear, it almost certainly isn't. 1 paragraph, half a page, given the length that we allow, is not going to be enough to explain to us and to explain to the assessors the nature of the project, the nature of the business, and the impact that it will have. At the same time, if you find yourself writing 20 pages, you've absolutely written too much. Okay, it's very difficult for assessors who have limited time to assess applications. They have the same amount of time effectively for each application. It's very difficult for us to do justice to 20 pages, whereas everyone else is 4 pages long. Effectively, you will disadvantage yourself. Please don't be obtuse. What do I mean by that? I mean, please don't use complicated long words like obtuse. Please keep it clear and keep it simple. You will be experts in your business areas. You're highly likely to be more expert in those business areas than us. please explain it so that the assessors can understand it. I have on occasion spent some time reading pages and pages of what are effectively chemical formulas and equations to demonstrate innovations. It fills up space, but it doesn't really explain much unless I happen to have a similar degree or higher level qualification in that particular area. Please consider that you're an expert and that your assessor is more likely to be an expert on business development rather than some complicated field of chemistry or medicine or whatever it may be. I mentioned style in here, and I say spell checker is there for a reason. It's most important to notice that we will never fail an application on the basis of spelling mistakes or poor grammar. So it's not going to be a deciding factor. Having said that, Microsoft Word and other packages do include spell checkers and grammar checkers. And it is only human nature that if you are reading an application that is filled with spelling errors, it does raise questions, knowing that there's a spell check that could be used, as to somebody's attention to detail. It's not necessarily going to have a major effect, but it does raise a flag that the application might have been rushed, it might not have been fully planned, and it hasn't been checked. So it does, you know, it's one of those things that is unsettling for an assessor. Excuse me. So please check the style and the spelling. This feeds very neatly into quality. I always say take your time to produce a quality application. If you're starting to write your application the day before the deadline, you have almost certainly left it too late. If you're writing your application a week or two before the deadline, then you should be okay. The bullet point on use our checking service, I've said unfortunately we can't really offer that, but please use somebody else to check it. I come on to proofreading later. Find someone and have them review it and read it for you. Even if they're not experts in the business, hopefully they can pick up any areas that are unclear, anything that doesn't make sense. And please, as the last element of quality, be consistent. Applications are often unsuccessful because of a lack of consistency. So what I mean by that is that if you've asked for a grant of £24,050 on page 1, please make sure that the grant requested remains at £24,050 on pages 3, 7, 9 and 10, everywhere else it appears. It is very difficult for assessors to assess a grant application if we're not entirely sure what it is we're assessing. If the grant applied for example, is different everywhere it comes up, we don't know how much grant you're actually applying for. And it will make a difference. If we come down to a point where we're having to select for budget reasons between two very, very similar applications, we're likely to go with the one that we're more comfortable with because we're sure that we know what it's doing. And filling everything in. Applications are sometimes unsuccessful because critical bits of the application form are left blank. If you're going to leave a box blank, could you put not applicable in that box and the form still makes sense? So for example, if you have a total project costs box, the form does not make sense if you put not applicable in it. Okay, you have to have a total project cost, otherwise we have no idea what the project costs. However, if you've not explored alternative sources of funding, then the box that asks you to name alternative sources of funding, you absolutely can put not applicable in. The form still makes sense. I have not explored other sources of funding, therefore this box is not applicable. That's fine. Next slide. Thinking about the content of your application, I've already said that you will be the experts in these areas. Linked to that, please don't assume prior knowledge. It is very easy to think, well, it goes without saying that, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone. If it goes without saying, remember that it never does. You will almost certainly one day come across an assessor who will not understand, who will not have that bit of prior knowledge, who will not understand that it goes without saying that. If you think that, if you find yourself thinking that, it's best to include it, because you're setting out the assumptions that underlie your application, the knowledge that underlies your application, which an assessor may not have. It's always good to start at the beginning, go on to the middle, and finish at the end. Applications are sometimes unsuccessful because they don't set the scene. They jump straight into the middle of what we want to do with the grant money, but they don't actually set the context of what the business is, what the business plans are, and how the grant relates to that. They get straight into the detail of what they're spending the money on, what we want to do with it. And then sometimes, of course, businesses are unsuccessful because they don't then say what the impact of the grant money is. Please remember, I hate this phrase, but in several years of doing these presentations, I still haven't come up with a better one. You are telling us a story. So you start at the beginning. This is who we are. This is what we do. This is what we're planning to do. You go on to the middle. This is our grant project. This is how we're going to deliver our grant project. And you finish at the end. This is the impact the grant project will have. Here are our next steps. Here's the benefits to the business. So the content then following that model is all relevant. Applications are often unsuccessful because they will spend half of the space of the application form detailing content that unfortunately is not relevant. And therefore you've disadvantaged yourself because you've left yourself with half as much space as the other applicants who put relevant content all the way through. Also think about what it is that we need to know. This relates back to the prior knowledge, it relates back to the structure of an application, and it also relates to making sure that assessors know and understand what it is that you're doing with your grant. If there's critical bits missing, you're more likely to be unsuccessful because assessors don't know. And it's not best practice for assessors to award grants where they don't really know what's going to happen, what the grant will be spent on. You are welcome to use attachments and to provide additional documents to support your grant application. Successful grant applications tend to be those which stand on their own. Unsuccessful grant applications will sometimes, I shouldn't generalize, but will sometimes be those that rely entirely or mainly on additional documents and attachments. Now, we understand that we've limited the space and there may be things that you need to include that are not relevant, as well as the things we explicitly ask for. If you are including attachments and additional documents that we have not requested, please do so sparingly. I've said before that assessors have effectively fixed time limits to review applications. If you attach 4 documents that are 200 pages each, it is, shall we say, highly unlikely that an assessor is going to read all of those documents, all of those 200 pages. If you attach 1 document that's 2 pages long, it's likely that an assessor will look through it. If you must attach long documents, the best way to do it and to handle it is to direct an assessor within the application form to a couple of pages in there. So for more information, see pages 2 to 3 of the attachment called whatever it's called. That way an assessor is more likely to look at the relevant parts of those attachments than to try and trawl through hundreds of pages. Next slide. There we go. So in terms of the process of doing the application, applications are often unsuccessful because they fail to RTQ. So that stands for read the question. The questions are in the application form, and they're also detailed in the guidance notes, along with indications of the sort of elements that we're looking for from the answers. Unsuccessful applications tend to be ones that have rushed and haven't taken the time to really read and understand the question. And therefore they fall down on the next point, ATQ, answer the question. Even if you have read and understood the question, if you answer a different question, your application is very likely to be unsuccessful. The question that we're asking is the question that the assessors will be scoring against. If a different question is answered, it is very unlikely that you'll be able to gain many points, a high score, in relation to a question that actually you haven't answered. So not only do you read the question, but you also then answer the question. And this is where some external sense checking can come in helpful. When we say 3 quotes, we do mean 3 quotes. I am unfortunately forced now to admit that there are circumstances in which you will not be able to gather 3 quotes. So if your ideal bit of market engagement, say, is through Facebook advertising, it's a quote from Facebook. And in that sort of situation, then yes, I will accept that only a single quote is possible. In an ideal world, from an audit trail point of view, if it really is impossible, you'll have some confirmation from other companies that they cannot provide quotes. As a compliance person, the ideal element for me is a quote from one company and then 2 responses from other companies saying, no, it's not possible for us to quote for this. The only organization that we know of is the first company that's given you the quote, company name inserted there. That would be ideal. Unfortunately, I've never seen it. But if it really is, you'll have some kind of confirmation that they can't quote. If you look at the 3 quotes and you start thinking, but I'm different, no, most projects are not. It's very unusual that a project will be sufficiently different. And certainly anything above 25,000 must be advertised on Contracts Finder. It must be an open procurement. There's no wiggle room on that one. And certainly if you're thinking, well, we've worked with them before, that's exactly the point about competition. The grant is public money, and we're required to ensure that it is spent transparently and with a competition, with some degree of competition and procurement. Next slide. So once you've done all that and you've been successfully awarded with a grant, please wait until we've awarded the grant before spending. The grant offer letter will have a date from which monies can be defrayed, so the earliest date eligible money can be spent. If that date is going to be different from the date in the grant offer letter, you must tell us. It absolutely cannot predate the date we award the grant. And the reason for that is that if you are willing to start defraying the grant costs without having the grant, then it's fairly obvious to an auditor that you didn't need the grant in order to defray the grant costs. You then need to actually spend it. It does still surprise me, the number of grant projects, leaving aside the impact of COVID, we do understand that has made life difficult for people, that don't actually then go and spend the grant that they've been awarded. What surprises me even more is that there are businesses out there who spend the money and then for whatever reason forget to claim it. Please claim it as soon as you've spent it. When you hit your claim date, put the claim into us so that we can reimburse you. We do, however, understand that these are innovation projects, so there will be delays and things will change. If that happens, please tell us. Please contact the team, let us know. This is one of those situations where it is miles better, it is by far better to ask for permission rather than to ask for forgiveness. And the last point is to please ensure that you provide the necessary evidence accompanying your claim. It's important that we have that so that we can process and approve your claim quickly and efficiently. Next slide. So we've now, looking at me being a few seconds early, reached the break part in the agenda. We're going to have a 15-minute comfort break at this point, and then we will come back at 15:15 for a panel with questions. So I will turn my camera and microphone off. The webinar will remain live, so please refill your coffee, and I will be back with Peter and Catherine to deal with questions at 15:15. Thank you very much. Hello again and welcome back. I hope everyone's managed to refill their coffee. Excellent. So I do actually have a couple more slides. Flipping on to the next one. Thank you. And the next one. I'm going to quickly run through these before I ask Catherine and Peter to join us for questions. This is really the focus of this bit is on the Go-create grants for the Innovation Support for Business project. A bit of an overview of the programme, the grant support that's available, the eligible activities for Go-create projects, and then that slide I promised about how Go-create's grants work. And again, the Q&A address for any questions that you still have after the webinar finishes. Next slide. Thank you. So the Innovation Support for Business programme has three distinct elements to it. There's the development of some innovation facilities across Oxfordshire, the delivery of innovation support products, so that's business support with a focus on supporting innovative businesses and innovating businesses, and the Go-create grant element. The programme did have some partners, though their activity came to an end at the end of last year. So that was the University of Oxford, the City Council, Sherwood District Council, and Oxford University Hospitals Trust. So the key elements of the programme, we've got innovation facilities, we have grants, and we have ongoing business support. Next slide. So the Go-create revenue grant pot. Go-create grants can be capital and or revenue. This is the revenue slide. The next slide is the capital one. We had an original programme budget of 875,000. We have committed £655,682.28, which means that our uncommitted amount, which is a smidgen over 25% of the grant pot, is £219,317.72. The maximum grant that we anticipate giving as a revenue grant under Go-create is £50,000. And we're offering a maximum grant rate still of 25%. So if your grant is £50,000 at a 25% grant rate, that means that your total project costs will be £200,000. Next slide. So for the capital pot, this is a lot smaller. We've been able to free up some capital budget. So this is a fairly new addition to the Go-create grant pot. The budget for this is 127,878.14. As I've said in previous slides, to count as capital, it's got to be at least £5,000. So if you're spending £5,000 of capital, effectively that's one item. And the maximum of 20,000. With again, the grant rate is at 25%. And we are willing to fund, as I said before, 100% capital grants under the programme. Our expectation is that the capital elements of Go-create projects are going to be easier and quicker to spend. So our expectation is that capital expenditure must be claimed within 12 weeks of the date of the grant offer letter. So the thinking behind that is that when you put the grant in, you've identified the capital items that you want. You've got your quotes lined up, decided which one you want to buy. As soon as we issue you with the grant offer letter, you can place your order. And then as soon as you've defrayed, at whatever point that's done, you can put the claim in. The expectation is that 3 months, 12 weeks is realistic for that. If you think it won't be, if there's a delay for shipping, if another skyscraper-sized boat gets stuck in the Suez Canal and delays your delivery, please just let us know. We do understand that these things happen. Next slide. So in terms of the eligible activities, capital or revenue, it's all about innovation. So it's about investment in product and or service development, technological and applied research, developing pilot lines and testing them, early product validation actions, and first production. So for your test initial clients. So it's all focused around innovation and bringing innovative technologies, developing them forward on the journey to commercialization. Next slide. Thank you. So in terms of eligibility, I say they have to be an innovation project delivered by an SME. We take what this slide is showing is our wide definition of innovation. So it can cover product, process, service. It is for you to tell us how and why your innovation is innovative. And that's a critical element to include in the application. The level of innovation is one of the things that we do assess. So although we take a very wide and broad approach to the definition of innovation, it's absolutely critical that you explain to us what is innovative. The ineligible sectors remain as they were on the earlier slide, so I don't really plan to go through those again. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is my promised slide about how it works. So let's say you have a Go-create grant offer with total eligible spend of £40,000. Now that can be capital, it can be capital revenue, capital and revenue. You know, the mixture is up to you. The maximum grant we can offer based on a 25% grant rate is £10,000. So if you have a £40,000 total cost and everything goes exactly according to plan, you spend your 40,000, sorry, exactly as you said you would, you submit a claim to us for 10,000 and we reimburse it. Fine. Unfortunately, we know that in the real world, things don't work like that. So in the first scenario, your total eligible spend ends up being 30,000, so you underspend against the approved grant. The maximum grant that we can pay against that £30,000 is locked at 25%, so it's 7,500. So if you underspend, the grant we can pay is based on the grant rate, based on the 25%. In the second scenario, this is where you may overspend on your project. So against your agreed £40,000 project costs, you actually end up spending 50,000. In this case, the maximum grant that we can pay out is limited to the £10,000 because that's the maximum grant we've offered. Okay, so it will either be 25% of your eligible expenditure or the cash value of the grant offered, whichever is lower. And we will have an introductory meeting with all the grant recipients where we run through this in slightly more detail, as well as take you through the grant claim forms and any details on the audit trail that we think need to be highlighted for your particular project. Next slide. So I did say I had a small number of slides, and that is basically it. You're welcome to watch this entire webinar over again as many times as you like. As I've said, it will be put online. The slides and the guidance notes will be on the OxLEP website. We will publish updated Q&As as we answer questions as they come in. And as I've said before, please email questions to the business@oxfordshirelep.com email address. And now I think the last slide is the questions slide. It is. So I'll ask Catherine and Peter to introduce themselves, to join and introduce themselves. And then Catherine's willing to chair and facilitate the question session for us.
Shall I introduce myself briefly, Catherine?
Go for it, Peter. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Peter Russell, obviously, it says there. I'm the Innovation Advisor for the ISfB program. So I work directly with potential applicants for this grant scheme and also giving general innovation support and advice to companies that have joined the program. So Yeah, happy to be here this morning and answer any questions that you've got coming up.
Great, thanks Peter. My name's Catherine Shepherd. I'm the Programme Coordinator for the ISfB programme, part of which is the Go-create grants. So we work as a small team and we just help to oversee the grant programme and to coordinate some of the other support that ISfB provides through things like one-to-ones and webinar support generally. So yeah, great. Thanks Peter, and thanks also for James for the presentation earlier. So we've had a couple of questions that have come in on the chat box. So the first one, I think, is, are there rules around where the match funding comes from? James, can I pass that to you?
There are a range of rules, some of which you as applicants need to worry about and some you don't. The critical one from our point of view is that the match has to be clean, what they call clean match. So what that means is that it can't be matched anywhere else. So you can't, for example, use another European source of match funding as match against these programs. If you have another ERDF project somewhere else, an ERDF grant, you can't use that money as match. Other rules relating to match will very much depend on the source of that match. So the simplest is cash in your bank, which is fine, absolutely fine. We report that as private match funding. If you have a grant from a local authority, for example, that can in theory be used as match, although it will depend on the conditions relating to that funding. If that's where it comes from, we need to know, because that is technically public match funding. So it will make a difference to our reporting, but not necessarily to your ability to use it. If you have a bank loan or a Sybil's loan, whatever it may be, that's eligible match. I think the thing is that if your match is, I hesitate to use the word unusual because that's not quite what I mean. But if you think there is anything about your match that you would need to clarify, I suggest you ask us, because it's one of those things where it's not quite on a case-by-case basis, but I could sit here and talk for a couple of hours about different types of eligible match and how it all fits together. And only about 60 seconds would be relevant to any individual company. So I suggest you ask us specific questions.
Brilliant, thanks very much, James. So the next question is, roughly what proportion of grants are getting approved? I would say probably if you submit a reasonable quality application and make sure to have read your presentation or watch your presentation first, James, that you've got a good chance. Peter, do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, absolutely. Compared to other schemes, you stand a pretty good chance if you've got a qualifying project, which in most cases we've probably helped you get right before you've even sort of got to the panel, got to the submission, so the final submission. So I think compared to an Innovate UK Smart Award, for example, the most obvious level of measure of competition is low, because a Smart Award will get hundreds and hundreds of applicants for each submission date, whereas we get a lot less than that. So we've probably been working with you on your application. So if it's going to go forward to the panel, you probably stand a pretty good chance of a successful award. It's not a volume game for us, it's more of a quality game.
Yeah.
Thanks, Peter. Just on your mention of SMART, we've had another question linked to the SMART grants that's come in, and perhaps we could have a look at that next. We've been thinking of a SMART grant. Would you be able to see what the pros and cons of each scheme are, please?
Yeah, I can have a go at that. I mean, just related to the previous questions, the challenge with a SMART award is that it's highly competitive. There will be hundreds of applications probably each time, and they'll come from a complete variety of sectors, different parts of the country, etc., etc. So you're kind of competing in a very wide pool. The advantages of a SMART award is that it is actually able to fund a more significant proportion of costs than we are. Simple as that. But you do have to fit quite narrowly within their definition of innovation activity. Now we take a broader definition, so we can support some of the activities and costs which a SMART award can't support. So probably a better way to think about it is how could you sort of knit the two schemes together potentially. And I think quite a few of our clients, they'll be looking to us to support an earlier stage in the innovation process, perhaps some proof of concept work or some market research or some testing work, etc., etc., and getting themselves ready to actually to be in a better position to be able to apply for a SMART award. You can't double fund, so we like to see, you know, clear water between the two types of projects and the two types of applications, sorry, and it may be for the overall, you know, same project in broad definition, but we need to see clear water between what we're supporting and what you may be able to get from another source, whether it's SMART or otherwise. So, and that's a couple of things. I mean, they are different schemes. So what you will have to do is do your homework basically and read into the differences between the schemes. Then you'll find out, well, you know, do I really fit with this one or do I really fit with that one? If I fit with both, it's probably for a different range of activities, you know, a different part of the innovation process. So that's an overview, but I am able to talk to people about SMART or other innovation schemes, including other Innovate UK schemes. I can't help you write your applications, but I've got some knowledge and experience of those programs. So, you know, that's one of the things that we could do if you join the Innovation Support for Business program, is look at the pros and cons of different schemes. James, do you want to add anything to that one?
No, I think that was very comprehensive. Thank you, Peter. It was nodding all the way through.
Good. You shake your head as well if you want, but you know.
Oh.
Brilliant, thanks both of you. So thanks, Peter. And James, back to you for a procurement question, if I can. So for a procurement up to 25,000, do you have to take the cheapest quote, assuming you had 3 quotes? And could you clarify where 3 quotes may not be required?
Okay, so question 1, do you have to take the cheapest of your 3 quotes? No, you don't. You're required to have 3 quotes and then to justify your choice, your decision. But the procurement terminology is that price is not the determining factor. So basically, you don't have to just go with the cheapest one. And that could be a range of different things. You might be getting a better quality of service. You know, one of the things we often find is that we get elements of added value in slightly more expensive responses. So there's no requirement to just go with the cheapest. It's much more considered than that. So the second question was, can I give some examples of when you don't need to get 3 quotes? So I think very small value procurements as set out in the guidance notes, there's no requirement for 3 quotes. But as I said in the presentation, if you believe that you're in a single tender position, so there is only one supplier that can realistically meet your requirements, the example I gave was Facebook for Facebook adverts, then you are in a position to justify a single supplier. What I've said also in the presentation is that you do need to think about what that justification looks like, because the justification for a single supplier that auditors will accept is because no one else can do it. It's not, I want to continue to use, I don't know, Amazon Web Services or something similar, because that's what I already use and it's a bit painful to change, that's not an acceptable justification. The justification would be that Amazon Web Services is the only people who can do whatever it is I need them to do. So you need to think through your justification for this sort of thing.
Fantastic.
As I say, if in doubt, sorry, Catherine. As I say, if in doubt, ask us.
Catherine, can I add something to that?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, so we do recognise that when you're working on a product development or an innovation, that you may have been in extensive discussions with potential suppliers and partners, because it takes a while to get a decent quote. If you're dealing on something complex. So I think I'm right in saying, and James can comment or add to this if you want to, obviously, but we may not expect each quote to be to quite the same level of detail. So you can get indicative quotes from people for product development work, technical design work, to give us the confidence that you are paying appropriate rates and paying an appropriate organisation as well. Because we do recognise that this is a tricky part when you're involved in innovation. You have to enter into discussions. It's not just like simply sort of going online and just getting an Amazon price in many situations. So yeah, I mean, we try and accommodate the reality of the innovation process there.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. That's a good point.
Brilliant, thank you. We just had a follow-on question to that. So if you do get 3 quotes, and regardless of the price, if you choose the supplier that you've worked and you happen to have worked with them before, that's not a problem, is it?
It's not a problem because you've got your 3 quotes and because you will give us a justification for that supplier that is slightly better than we worked with them before. So there'll be more to your justification for choosing that supplier. It will be about price, it will be about quality, it will be about level of service. I do see a lot of people who talk about familiarity with the business and the innovation, which harks back to Peter's last point. That's acceptable. I can live with that. But you've got, a range of reasons that justify your choice of this supplier. It's not just I always like James, so I always go to James. Does that make sense?
It does, it does. I think that answered it very well. So thanks very much, James. A couple more compliance related ones, if I might, James. Just one on the match funding first. A couple regarding kind of the salaries angle. So can we include new employees in the cost? No, staff costs are not eligible. So if they're not an eligible cost, can they be claimed still as match funding?
Eligible costs covers both the ERDF grant and the match funding eligible and the match funding element of the project. So your grant project all of the costs must be eligible costs. And unfortunately, one of the irritating elements of ERDF and the Managing Authority's guidance is that we can't cover staff costs. So if anything goes through PAYE, it's not going to be eligible, whether it's ERDF or match.
Perfect. Okay, that's great. Thanks, James. And then a couple of questions on Escalate. Are we able to describe the difference between Go-create and Escalate? Is it possible to apply for both programs simultaneously? And perhaps are you able to give a bit of an update on where we are with Escalate, James?
Yes, I am. So can you apply for both programs? Yes, you can, but clearly for different projects. ISfB Go-create is innovation focused. Escalate is for, what's the wording, businesses with a social purpose, so social enterprise side of things. Also investment readiness and access finance support for scale-up businesses, and some more general business development, business growth type activities. You will notice that I haven't really talked about Escalate today. That's quite deliberate. The last Escalate grant deadline is the deadline in April. We are expecting that after that deadline, we're going to have committed all of the available funding under the scheme, all of the available grant funding under the scheme. We're also expecting that this will be that there will be significant interest in this final deadline. I think the sense that we're getting from the business community is that we'll have quite a lot of applications coming in this time. And for the first time, we will be in a position realistically of having a limited budget and having far more grant applications than we have budget. It's not a surprise as you come to the end of an available grant pot, but it's part of the reason that the focus today was on Escalate rather than, was on ISfB rather than Escalate. But yes, you can apply for both, but ISfB grant side of things we're expecting will come to an end this month. Have I answered all the elements of that question?
Yeah, and I think you have, James. But the thing I'd add is, I would encourage people to kind of read between the lines here. If you've got a project which is clearly about innovation, the Escalate team are probably going to have to say that's one better applied for Go-create. Simple as that.
Yeah, good point, Peter. Thank you. Thanks. So, Peter, if I might come to you with an innovation-y type question. So regarding innovation, is it an advantage if there are a few similar innovative products already available on the market in order to use these as a comparison in your application, or should there be no even similar comparison already available?
Yeah, that's a more interesting question, actually. The truth is there is no such thing as something completely unique, to be honest. So it would be a great surprise to us if there wasn't something already out there that did something similar to what you're proposing. When I read grant applications and I help people and they say there is nothing else out there, I just say that I'm pretty sure, give me half an hour, I'll find something which is similar, even if I have to go to the Intellectual Property Office database and start looking at patents. So when you're bringing something new to market, it actually helps if there are already things out there which are proving the way or proving that there is a market for something. So absolutely talk about it. If it's out there, talk about it. Don't pretend that it's not out there. As I said before, one of the things, actually, when we were talking before about SMART tends to support things which are highly innovative. And it can do that because it can differentiate and have a scoring system within the grant process, which is trying to find those really groundbreaking type innovations. So a high degree or a step change, or one of those other words that people used for significant innovation. We're able to support slightly more incremental, but we just don't want Me Too products or Me Too services. But we are able to support things which are good, but aren't likely to change the world. And if there are other things out there which are proving the way, then that could be an advantage. As long as you could say that you stand a reasonable chance of bringing this forward in the face of that competition, then that's fine. And you have to give us your reasons for doing that, and you would do that in the application form and in the supporting business plan. So in general, I would think, if there is stuff out there, then talk about it. It's not necessarily a weakness. Just tell us where you sit in relation to those other products and services. And obviously, it's in your interest to present them as an advantage rather than a great risk to your own success. James, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's very fair. I mean, I agree. Whenever I'm told that something is the equivalent of a perpetual motion machine that nobody's ever managed, You know, my first stop as a non-expert is Mr. Google, and you'll be surprised how many things you can find when you search that look fairly similar. So I'm a lot happier seeing, you know, that this is innovative. There are other things out there, but we stand out, and our, you know, our market entry, our commercialization is realistic because there's a differentiation.
Yeah,
but it's an interesting question.
At the other end of the scale, I think we don't really want to use this money. The money isn't intended just for general improvements to things, which you are going to do in any case. And if we get a sense of that in the application, then the panel probably won't look too favorably on it. You know, if you just sort of, for example, over the last year, as expected, you know, at the beginning of the pandemic, we had a lot of people sort of thinking, can I apply to you because I'm going to have to go online? Well, you know, it was a tough situation for everybody, but I don't think we really encouraged applications where there was no innovation in going online. You know, it was just coping with the situation, and probably something that you would have been doing in any case, gradually moving some stuff online. So avoid that kind of what we call purely improvement-based stuff and innovation, and convince us that there is something different and interesting, which is going to open up new market potential for you, and Oxfordshire will benefit as a result.
Fantastic. That's great. Thanks, Peter. That leads us into a couple of IP questions, if I can. So firstly, the guidance mentions exploiting IP, which I think is where we mention about us supporting early stage development and development of prototypes and things. Can the grant be used to generate IP as well? And if so, another related question, can IP protection costs be funded through the grant, such as patents and trademarks, etc.?
I'll answer that in a sort of, the answer is yes. If you're not generating any intellectual capital in your project, then it's probably not very innovative. Whether you generate intellectual property, which are, you know, different forms of rights, well, that's a business decision as well as a technical decision. But in general, yes, the scheme is all about supporting you to generate intellectual property or intellectual capital. Yeah. Now, we can support the direct costs of securing the intellectual property. So what I mean by that is, if you need the advice of an expert, and you probably will at some point, in how to generate, how to put together an intellectual property strategy, how to understand what you can and can't apply for, how to create, you know, and start working towards a patent. That advice is typically quite expensive, and yes, we can contribute to the cost of that. So that is an eligible cost. What we can't support is the application fees and things like that. So what we can't support is the kind of, like, we can't pay your rent, you know, it's a business as normal type of cost, and it's a statutory cost, so we can't pay for that. But if we see an invoice for intellectual property advice and guidance, and there's no mention of fees and stuff like that for the patent office, then we can support those costs. But, and going back to the original point, yes, absolutely, this is all about supporting you to create IP or intellectual capital if it's not actually registerable IP, if you see the distinction there.
Great, thanks, Peter. James, did you have anything to add?
No, that's very comprehensive. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks both. So In terms of claiming for the cost then, and just the order of events and also the timescales, do we need to buy the resources first, then get the grant, or can we just, do we need to get the grant and then claim the cost retrospectively? So the answer to that is the second one, isn't it? You get the grant first of all and don't pay any bills or have any invoices dated until the grant's been awarded.
Yes, that's right. But then you must always defray the cost. You must always pay those invoices before you can claim it from us. So we can't pay the grant in advance of need. So you will as an applicant have to cash flow your grant project until you put the claim in to recover the grant element from us.
Yeah, I'll just add something, because I'm sure James is probably tired of saying it. There is no retrospective funding. There is reimbursement of costs. That's the way to think about it. So you apply to us to do a piece of work. Don't start that work. You can't tell us that you've started that work. Now, in reality, you would have been thinking about it and preparing for it and lining everything up, but don't start incurring costs until you've got a grant offer letter, if at some point in the future you're going to use those costs as part of your claim.
Yep, absolutely.
Great, thanks both. James, would you be able to clarify again the point about the time allowed for the money to be spent once the grant has been awarded, which I'm guessing relates to the capital part of the grant?
Yes, I assume that relates to the capital grant of the capital part of the grant. Even you will set out in your grant offer letter some proposed claim dates, the dates by which you think you will have spent the money, and the dates on those dates on which you will submit grant claims to us. For the revenue part, it's fairly straightforward. Tell us how long you think it will take to deliver the project, and tell us when you think you'll claim the money. For the capitals part, our expectation is that you will be able to claim for the capital costs within about 12 weeks, so 3 months. And that is based on an assumption that a capital cost is an easier thing to defray. So what I mean by that is that if you've identified the machine that you want to buy and you've got your 3 quotes for that machine and they're part of your grant application, the day that we give you the grant offer letter and it's signed, you can then turn around and order the machine. You'll then either pay for it then or pay for it when it's delivered, say 6 weeks later, at which point you're ready to put the claim into us. So it's a simpler process, whereas if you're paying a consultant to provide you a service, what you might find is that you're paying them based on monthly invoices or staged payments or payments at the end of their service. As I say, that is an assumption. So if that doesn't work for you for whatever reason, so you've ordered something and you'll make an initial payment and then 4 months later, say, pay the balance, then you design your claim process that says, well, our first claim will be after we've made the initial payment, and our next claim will be after we've made the final payment. So it's not entirely fixed in stone, but there is, as I say, our expectation that capital will be spent more quickly and easily than revenue funding.
Great, thanks. Peter, did you have anything to add?
No, I mean, I get asked a more broader question about, you know, project length, and as we move through the program, you know, obviously we're going to be starting to look for shorter projects rather than longer projects. At the moment, I think what most people feel comfortable with is project timescales which are between 3 and 6 months. And to be honest, people start out with sort of quite ambitious plans to begin with, but once you've really fully understood the cash flow implications of the way that we have to work, projects ended up being a bit more modest in terms of grant amount and also project timescale. So I'd just be generally thinking, whether it's capital or revenue, or, you know, obviously the combination of the two for project timescales of between 3, 4, 5, 6 months. You know, that works best for us, and is probably more feasible for most people to be able to manage a project like that. I don't think I answered the question totally, but I just thought it's sort of context, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, very helpful. Thanks, Peter. Thanks. And yeah, on the capital element specifically, but applies to both and probably to the project costs overall, just to clarify on the grant rate. So if you were applying for 100% capital, the grant rate would still be 25%.
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, and then just back on the IP, Peter, if I might come back to you on that one, just as you kindly picked that up before. So the end result of the grant could just be a patent.
Well, if the end result of the grant was a patent, that'd be great, but it takes 3 years to get a patent, so I don't think that's likely. If the end result of the project is a patent application, then I think that would be fine. But I mean, to be honest, I think in that particular example, actually, I mean, this is a general point. You know, we can talk to you about what project you're thinking about before you go to the bother of, you know, making an application. And I would, in that particular example, I'd encourage that person to have a chat with us about what they're thinking of doing, because the end result can be a multiple things. It's basically that you've managed to move the project from point A to point B. So as long as we know what point A was or is and what point B is intending to be, there's a number of things which are acceptable as project deliverables or outputs and outcomes. If it's some intellectual capital or property, excellent, but it doesn't have to be.
Perfect.
Is that reasonable, James? Because I've not been asked that in quite the same way before.
No, that is entirely reasonable. I'm just thinking about projects we've approved that will usually, but not always, have one of the clear deliverables ticked off. You know, it is possible for a project to make progress towards commercialization, towards developing their innovation, without necessarily achieving any of the sort of deliverables that we'd normally look for. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you count yourselves out. So I think Peter's absolutely right. If you can define where you're starting from and clearly define where the grant will get to and demonstrate that that is relevant and valid on your development journey, then I'm happy with that as an approach to an application. Yeah, it's an interesting question.
And we have supported projects that have no, shall we say, registerable, is that a word? No intellectual property that is able to be registered. So, you know, it might not qualify as a patent. At best, it might be copyright, design registry, or none of those. And we still supported the project because we identify it as good innovation work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions still to cover, and I know we're kind of running a bit short of time, but perhaps if we could take a couple more, if that's okay, and then anything else we don't pick up, we can always come back to. So just on the type of projects that we do support, so projects that are entirely or majority R&D based and intended to evolve new capabilities in an existing product, such as software, would they be eligible? And if so, could the funding be used to support employee costs, which would be no, but they could use the grant towards a consultant to help with that development work of the existing product?
Yeah, quite a few people do apply to us for the cost of development expertise, which they don't have in-house. And that's quite a nice thing, you know, like we need this expertise, but we don't, you know, we're not of a scale to employ that person full time. So we'll use a contractor, and it might be a contractor that you've used before, but then you've got to think about the procurement guidelines that we talked about before. So yes, if you're making a significant improvement to an existing product or service and it involves software, that wouldn't be unusual. You still have to convince us that it's more than just you know, another product variation or, you know, version 1.75. So I think as long as you can demonstrate that it's a reasonable, innovative step, then I don't see why not. And one of the measures of that is opening up new markets and opportunities. So if your customers are just needing this incremental improvement, but you're not going to grow the business that much as a result, then it's probably not kind of what we're looking for. But if you're introducing an innovation or you know, a product of a significant variation and it's going to open up new markets and opportunities, then that fits absolutely.
And another related question then, can we apply for funding towards an ongoing project? Based on your answer, the answer to that, or your last answer, the answer to that would be yes, but it would need to be an innovative new step of an existing project.
Yeah, I mean, this is I deal with very little which isn't ongoing in somebody's definition. So, because you know, it didn't start. Things don't start at the point we give you a grant. I know that's the way we have to think about it for the administration, but we know that things are ongoing and continuous. So, yes, absolutely, you can apply for a part of an ongoing project, but we have to know the beginning, middle and end of the bit that we are supporting. And I think some of the applications which James referred to earlier on and that we see, they're just a bit vague about, you know, the bit that we are being asked to help with. So as long as you know, and we can help you with that, you know, as long as you can define that element of the overall journey that you're on, then we can support it. Actually, it's quite a nice thing to do if we're helping, you know, a project which is otherwise struggling. You know, if we can make the difference, that's even better.
Anything to add, James?
No.
Perfect. We do still have a couple more questions. I'm aware of the time. Are you happy to take a couple more, or we can?
Yeah, I can just a couple of quick
dark at 6:30, I think, doesn't it, Catherine? Yeah. I don't want to be here that long.
I have various other calls and meetings before that, so.
We'll just whiz through. There's not many. There's just a couple there to cover off. So quickly, if your innovation project doesn't create jobs but does increase economic activity, does it qualify? So that's in terms of the impacts we expect to see from applications and grants.
Yes, describe the impact. Sorry, very quick answer there. Yes, absolutely it counts. Please describe the impact that you will have.
Brilliant, thank you. That clarifies that one. So if an innovative product could potentially develop into a spin-off business, is that relevant or an advantage? If a spin-off business, is it an advantage if a spin-off business comes out of the grant application or is foreseen to?
Yeah, it's not necessarily an advantage. It's just part of your commercialization strategy. So if the best way to exploit the innovation is through a separate entity, then just tell us that's part of the plan. If that separate entity creates new jobs, even better. You know, if it opens up new markets and opportunities, well, presumably it would be doing that. Otherwise, why would you need a separate entity? It's fine. And we have supported people who have subsequently gone on to set up a special purpose vehicle or a new entity to take the thing to the next stage. Absolutely.
Brilliant. That's great. Thank you very much, Peter. So in terms, James, probably this is a question for you. In terms of eligible costs, can we include in one application different aspects of the same project, such as website design, mentoring, marketing development, or do we need to make different applications? That's probably an easy question to answer, isn't it? You can only have one grant from Go-create, but you can apply as many times as you like until hopefully you're successful.
I'm not sure I would necessarily encourage people to bombard us with umpteen applications each round. But you're absolutely right, Catherine. You can reapply if you're unsuccessful, but you can only be successful once. There is no requirement to split your project into lots of tiny little applications. If you have a project that's going to cost you £200,000, put in an application for £200,000 total cost. Don't put in 4 applications of £50,000 because I can't see any particular benefit to that. In fact, my suspicion is that if assessors had to read 4 different versions of pretty much the same application, I suspect you would end up with a, shall we say, less sympathetic view at the end of reading the same thing 4 times, rather than reading a single coherent, clear application covering the whole project. The risk would be that the assessors are not willing to support one element of your activity because they can't necessarily see how it works without the other parts. So I would say if you've got marketing and development activity and different things, apply, but it's all part of one coherent innovation development project. As Peter said, here's where we are, here's where we get to, and here are the 3 or 4 different elements of activity that get us there, and all taken together, that's our project.
Yeah, I read that question slightly different way, but the answer is the same. I mean, within most of the projects that I'm helping people with, there are different, what we call, and I'd encourage you to think of as work packages. So these are different elements within the overall work plan. And don't make it, like James said, don't make it too complicated. So, typically you might have a technical work package, say, for example, the previous example, working with some software developers. But you might also have a market research package, working with a market research provider. And combine those together in the same overall application is an entirely sort of sensible thing to do if you're facing external costs and you want a contribution towards them. Then it becomes a practical decision about timescales and cash flow again. So yeah, absolutely, we can support different elements within, or different types of things within an overall sort of project roadmap, if you like.
Fantastic. Just 2 last questions then, probably one for you, Peter, first of all, might come to you. So can we use the Go-create grant to support the creation of a manufacturing prototype and the first manufacturing stage of a new product?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, I mean, most of our things are about proof of concept or initial prototypes or bench testing, that kind of thing. But if it's a pre-production prototype, first stage manufacturing, in advance of being able to scale up and fully exploit it, I don't see why not.
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. That's great. Thanks both. And then the last question then, which I did partially have a go at answering, James, but I think this is probably more one that needs your expert clarification on. So the government's Kickstart scheme being publicly funded, where a new job to be supported, it would obviously have to postdate the awarding of the grant to be counted as an impact. Were the new job to be supported through the Kickstart scheme, would that be eligible as an impact of the grant? And if so, at what point would that eligibility need to kick in, if that makes sense?
Yes, I think that makes sense. I'm not completely familiar with Kickstart, but in terms of the principle, for a job to be eligible under ISfB, there is a declaration from the company that effectively says, as a result of the support we had from ISfB, we've been able to create this job or the following jobs, and then there's a list of them and a description. Now, provided you can demonstrate that the project support has resulted in that job being created, I'm comfortable that that will be an acceptable deliverable for ISfB. If you are funding that job from a variety of different sources, one of which happens to be the Kickstart scheme, my sort of strict compliance view from ISfB is that that's your business. How you resource your company, how you resource your business is entirely up to you. The project might have created the need for a job that you can't resource, that therefore isn't filled, so it doesn't exist. But if we've created the need for a job that you're then able to fill in some way, shape or form, I don't see too much of a conflict between reporting the deliverable. It's something that I suspect we're going to see, certainly with Kickstart, more frequently, so we will probably need to seek some clarification on how it works. But my reading of the deliverables definitions are that if you have created a job thanks to the ISfB support that you've received, then we can report that job created, regardless as to how you go about funding the post itself.
Brilliant, that's great. Okay, that's all of the questions. Thank you very much to you both. Do you have any final comments to add, James? Or?
Not really, just thank you all for listening, and I think for virtually all of you for sitting through the full 2.25 hours by the time we're done, and good luck with your applications.
Yeah,
same
absolutely.
from me. Yeah, and no, we look forward to seeing some, and don't forget, you can always send an email with an outline of your ideas, you know, just so that we can give you some feedback on whether it fits before you go too far. We do get people that haven't really understood the cash flow, the match fund, and the procurement stuff. So, you know, rather than talk at length about a project which actually isn't ready to start for 6 months for that reason, I'd encourage you to sort of think about those aspects before you get in contact, and make sure you can cope with those. But then if you can do that, then we look to help you shape the project accordingly.
Absolutely, and as always, if people would like to send us a short synopsis of the types of things they'd like to use the funding for, we'd be happy to give any comments on that. And if people have got any questions, then please just send them to the email address that James has said several times, the business@oxfordshirelep.com address, and we can get back to you on those as quickly as we can. Okay, that's great. Well, thanks again, James and Peter, for your expertise and input and time and effort today. Much appreciated. And thanks everyone very much for coming along. I hope you found it helpful, and yes, please do keep in touch. Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks.